First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me here. My name is Marcus Runefors, and I'm a lecturer at the Division of Fire Safety Engineering at Lund University. What I will be presenting today is a comparison between fatal home fires and rescues. The research presented here is a part of my PhD thesis that I defended 1.5 years ago. But in this talk, I will focus exclusively on the response aspects, but the thesis also included prevention aspects. I would like to start with a description of the case that got me interested into fire service response at the first time. From time to time, I read fire investigation reports because I find them very instructional when you want to learn more about fire dynamics in actual fires and not limited to very simplified experimental conditions. This is a fire in Örnsköldsvik in Sweden. The fire started down in this apartment here, and somebody called the fire service. And when they came to the scene, they found 2 older individuals on this balcony here. They had limited mobility, so they couldn't evacuate themselves. So the fire service had to bring a manual ladder and take them down. Further into the fire, they found 1 more individual in this apartment, 1 floor above the fire floor. That individual was in pretty bad shape, but still managed to survive. This fire made me think because it is here we have 3 individuals that might have died if the fire service would not have responded to the fire. And comparing this to the number of fatal fires we have in Sweden, which is typically in the order of 80 per year, this is more than 3% in a single incident. So we don't need to have too many of those fires for them to be quite effective in preventing fatal fires. So this is something that I wanted to investigate a lot closer. But I started by thinking, why were my original impression that people were very rarely saved by the fire service in fires? And I think a lot of it has to do with this film here that is shown in the fire service, in basic fire service training quite a bit. It's called 3 minutes because we have 3 minutes from ignition to flashover. And if this would be the typical fire, nobody would be able to be rescued by the fire service. But it's also quite optimum from a fire development standpoint. We have a flaming ignition source, we have a big fuel, and we have a lot of ventilation. So this is not what your typical fire scenario would look like, which all fire service personnel knows already. But the question is, so why are not everybody dead in 3 minutes? And as I said, that's the reason is that this is not the typical fire development. And there are 3 main reasons as I see it. One is that quite few ignition sources are actually flaming. Most of them, and the most deadly ones, are smoldering. The most famous ignition source is smoking, which is behind approximately 40% of all fire fatalities. And we also have warm light bulbs, such things. And they both will typically induce a smoldering fire, which will take quite some time to develop into a flaming fire. The exact mechanism behind it is quite unknown, but the experiments show that we're typically in the range between half an hour and 2 hours for transitioning from smoldering to flaming fire. Another reason is that the situation is much better behind a closed door, as we can see in the middle picture down there. And this is probably why we see a lot of deliberate fires in the rescues. Because if you ignite the fire and you don't, this is almost always suicide attempts. And the throat hurts a lot when you inhale a lot of smoke gases. So you might take refuge into another room and close the door. The third reason, to the bottom right there, is that the fire might be fuel limited or air limited for a specific time. In that picture, we have an air limited fire because it started under the sink. and it took some time before it could go through the doors. And also we often see in experiments where we have the first item igniting, we have a typical T-square fire growth, but then it takes some time to preheat the second object before that jumps off. So it will take some time for the fire to develop in most actual fires. Going into the actual study here, I used this definition of a rescue. The definition was at least one individual would be severely injured or killed if the fire department would have arrived 30 minutes later at the scene. The 30 minutes here might seem a bit arbitrary, but it's based on a pre-study I did where I interviewed a number of fire service personnel. And because first I had if the fire service would not have arrived to the scene, but a lot of people thought that was a bit peculiar because at some point we always will have a fire service arriving. So I added 30 minutes to make it more understandable to the informants. And also if we would have a fire fatality 30 minutes, more than 30 minutes into later, that would be a bit difficult to assess in practice. So this is how I did it. During the year was 2017, so it's a few years back now. I got all the incident reports from the Swedish Civil Contingency Agency, where the fire service ticked the box that they performed the rescue. We know already from before that they tick this box a bit too often, and not all of them are actual real rescues. And for all those cases, I believe it was in the order of 130 cases. Sorry, I performed a phone interview with the commander who were first at scene to really have them describe the fire and sort of prove that it would have been a fatality if they wouldn't have arrived as they did, or arrived more than 30 minutes later. I often got pictures and movies and other things that may help my assessment. It might be seen as a bit subjective, but in practice, it was quite apparent in most cases that if it was rescue or not. It was few cases that were a gray zone, because often the victim would be in pretty bad shape, or the fire would be quite substantial by them. The results showed that during that year, we had 51 rescues. At the beginning, I didn't limit it to residential occupancies, but since we only had rescues from residential occupancies in 2017, I chose to only compare it to fatalities in residential occupancies. So we can see that during that year, we had 88 fatalities and 51 rescues. So it's quite substantial part of, in comparison to the fatalities. Actually, if we would not have the fire service response, the number of fatalities would have increased by 58%. One thing that is also of interest is who alerted the fire service. And we can see that the most common was a neighbor, possibly hearing a smoke alarm or seeing flames or smoke. Could also be the victim, either through a safety alarm or through calling into the fire service. Or in some occasions, people passing. A second interesting question, I think, is how the rescue was performed. And we can see that the most common way of performing rescue is an interior attack with a breathing apparatus, 71%, and also a breathing attack without the breathing apparatus. And then we have the manual ladder and the aerial apparatus. This is quite similar to the results found by the study at IFV, which I think has been presented in this forum before. However, this doesn't tell the entire picture, because when the fire service arrived to the scene, they typically already have a breathing apparatus equipped. So that would be a natural first choice. So a more interesting question could probably be that how large fraction could the method have been used? I know from previous presentation of this study that this might be a bit difficult to get your head around, but how you should interpret this is that if you only would have the opportunity of doing an interior attack with the breathing apparatus, you would be able to perform 98% of the rescues, 98% of those 51 rescues. If you only would have a manual ladder, you could have performed rescuing 24% of those 51 cases. And you can see that it's what 24% of for both the manual ladder and the aerial apparatus, because they have different benefits. The manual ladder, of course, is more flexible. You can use it in more situations, but the aerial apparatus has a higher reach. And you should not interpret those as fixed values, because it's only 51 cases. So it's more of an order of magnitude estimation than a specific percentage. Another interesting question is why did we not have a self-evacuation? And the most common reason was that the evacuation routes were blocked by fire and smoke. And also we had quite a number of people who were asleep at the time of the fire. Either they didn't have a smoke alarm or they didn't wake due to the fire. Among those, 20% is probably a part of those drugs. Parts also, but the drugs, the 5% here, are the ones who are awake, but they're too influenced by the drugs and don't really get their head around what's going on, so they don't evacuate. Suicide also quite common. In fatal fires, it's typically in the order of 10%, so it's slightly above. We also have quite a big fraction that doesn't evacuate due to disability, 25%. The last box there, the extinguishing attempt, is individuals who try to extinguish the fire instead of evacuating, and therefore becomes blocked by the smoke. I will not go too much into that. It's a different study, but I found that approximately 20% of fire fatalities had the opportunity to evacuate themselves, but chose not to do so to try to extinguish the fire and perish in the fire. That's a different study, but I just wanted to mention the result there. Another thing that might be of relevance from a tactical standpoint is where the fire service located the rescue. And we can see that it's quite, it's a range of different rooms. Bedroom is common, living room is common, balcony, of course, where they take refuge. So it's not a very strict, very apparent, this is the room where you should go first to find the victims. It seems to be a bit mixed around different rooms. But maybe bedroom is a good first option, depending on the time of day, I guess. I've shown already a lot of statistics, so I wanted to show also some, or describe a few actual cases from the study. Starting to the top left there, when the fire service arrived to the apartment, they found an individual lying in the bed with a small flame on his bed sheet and with a small wet towel where he tried to extinguish the fire. One thing that was a bit peculiar at first when I talked to the commander is why would that individual have a wet towel next to him? But we realized quite quickly that this was because this wasn't the first time he dropped his cigarette on his bedclothes. He'd done this a number of times, but usually he managed to extinguish it. And this is also what is typical for many fatal fires, where we can see hundreds of burn marks on the floor before the individual dropped the cigarette that actually caused the fire. It's also important to acknowledge that this individual has home care. He has home care personnel here several times a day, and I guess they would have noticed a lot of burn marks on the bedclothes, but they didn't do anything about it. Anyway, going back to the response here, when the fire service came through, as I said, there were small flames on the bedcloth, and the fire service took the bedcloth, put it into a shower, and extinguished it. So in this case, they were actually extremely lucky, because if they would have arrived just 1 or 2 minutes later, the entire bed would be on fire, and the individual would have perished. Top right, we have a mother and 2 kids sleeping in their bedroom. the smoke alarm is going on in the hallway, but they didn't wake up. But somebody noticed the smoke alarm and called 911. So the fire service went through the door and extinguished the fire under the sink here. Bottom left, a grandfather and his grandkid were standing on the balcony and couldn't evacuate due to a fire in the hallway. They charged a hoverboard in the hallway, so that blocked their way out. So the fire service had to help them out with an aerial apparatus. Bottom right, we have a mother and 3 kids in the kitchen, and the mother went to the fire here in the bed and tried to extinguish it, but didn't manage. So she went back to her kitchen to get her kids, but by then the fire had grown so much that she couldn't evacuate. So she closed the door to the kitchen and called 911. And the dispatcher talked to them over time while the fire service responded, but suddenly it got quiet because the smoke layer has descended down to them. But then just a second later, the dispatcher heard a large boom in the phone, and that was the fire service knocking down the door and going in. And you can see that the individuals were actually in pretty bad shape when they were rescued, but all of them survived. Here is a comparison between the rescues and fatalities. And I don't know if you've seen this kind of chart before, but it's sort of a case control, the method from epidemiology, where we compare cases are rescues, controls are fatalities, and we compare them on a number of different variables. The ones that are listed here is only the one that have a statistically significant effect on the probability of survival, on the probability of rescue. So all the variables that have points to the right of the one here are linked to an increased probability of rescue, while the ones that have a box to the left are linked to a decreased probability of rescue. One thing that is quite apparent is that factors related to a short response time increases the probability of rescue. So you see short response time, higher probability, long response time, lower probability. The second is that with a typical high-risk individual, smoker living alone, rather high age, are not very common among the rescues. But we see more deliberate fires in this category compared to the general, to the fatalities. One aspect that is probably linked to a deliberate aspect is the taking refuge, as I described before, that you would typically try to take refuge somewhere from the fire if you do a deliberate fire. And we also see that apartment is more common than houses. One thing that is relative is probably response time, because we typically have a shorter response times to apartments than we have to houses, but it could also be other factors. I mentioned already the importance of response time, and you can see here in the chart, in the X direction, we have response times in minutes, and in the Y-axis, we have the fraction rescued. And we can see that if we have response time below 10 minutes, we are in the order of slightly above 50% probability of a successful rescue. But after that, it will decrease first down to 20% or so, between 10 and 90 minutes, and then we have basically no chances of performing a rescue. We also corrected for differences in scenarios, and we still found a very significant effect of response time on the probability of rescue. We use this to derive an equation for the probability of a rescue for a specific unit, depending on the effectiveness of that unit. The effectiveness is based on the capabilities that the unit has, that I showed before, the pie chart, the 98% for the interior attack with the breathing apparatus, etc. So you can not only look at the response time, but also what is responding, what kind of capabilities do that unit have. Just as an example, we can compare the typical way of organizing the fire service in Sweden is that you would have a commander and 4 firefighters in truck. That unit can perform an interior attack with the breathing apparatus, interior attack without the breathing apparatus, of course, and also a manual ladder. An alternative way of doing it, which is also getting more and more common, is that the commander has its own truck. It's a small personal vehicle. If they arrive individually, they cannot do the interior attack with the breathing apparatus. It's not allowed in the legislation, but they can perform interior attack without the breathing apparatus, and the big truck can also perform rescues with the manual ladder. When they both vehicles are on scene, of course, they can do the same things as the truck at the top here. So they can perform also interior attack with the breathing apparatus. So just an example here again, time to first alarm. I took the median of all the rescues and fatalities, which was alarm handling time of 1 minute and 31 seconds. Then I added the turnout time, which in Sweden are 1.5 minutes. Then I added driving time, which was a random variable. So put in a different way, I have the same probability of arriving in 1 minute and 10 minutes, and every minute in between. And I assume that the small personal vehicle and the truck moved independently. So this sort of tells you that this gives you a higher probability of a lower driving time for one of them, if you have two. So I could compare them, and the probability of a successful rescue for the top way of organizing thing was 39%, and for the bottom one, 46%. And that can be translated into that if the way of organizing things to the top saves 10 individuals, the bottom way would save 12 individuals. So you can use this to compare different way of organizing the fire service. For example, one fire service in Sweden used this methodology to see if they should buy a new aerial apparatus for a small fire station out in the rural area. So they compared them and put that into a cost-benefit analysis to see if it was the investment motivated. Another way of doing it is doing a map. I guess you've all seen these kind of time to arrival maps, but this is translated into a probability of rescue. So you can also account for the type of unit that responds. So you can do this both as a single location to compare different options, as they did with aerial apparatus I mentioned, but you can also use this dynamically during if you have a large scale incident like a flood or a forest fire that takes a lot of your resources. You can see how does this affect my capability of performing a rescue. So conclusions, 51 rescued individuals in 2017, which translates into 1.5 per 1 million. And also the number of fatalities in residential occupancies would have increased by 58% without the fire department response. In the Swedish building legislation, we have a number of 10 minutes response time, and you can do that affects the level of protection you need in some aspects. And that turned out to be actually not totally wrong when it comes to saving lives. One thing that surprised me quite a bit is that we have a lot of interior rescues. There are people, of course, in balconies and at windows and stuff, but it's quite often that the fire service had to go into the actual fire department because they took refuge into a room, for example. And often to quite big fires where you need your breathing apparatus. There's also quite a number of suicide attempts, as I described already. The method derived, I believe, is promising, but as I said also, that it's only based on 51 rescues, so we would need more data to reduce uncertainty. So much about fire service rescue, but there's also other people or other actors who can perform rescues. So I want to briefly describe another study where we compared older adults, 65 and above, who survived fires with injuries and compared them to fatalities. We did so by assessing the free text field in the incident reports to assess the mode of evacuation. I think we had in the order of 345 rescues, no, survivals with injuries, I should say. And we could actually, in most cases, see from the free text field how they came out, how they evacuated. And we could see that self-evacuation was, of course, quite common, 39%, but also a lot of people in this group depended on other actors for their safe evacuation. We see that neighbors are important, home care are important, first responder, we knew that already from the previous study, that quite a number of people are rescued by the fire service. First responder here is not exclusively fire service. It's also a few cases where they are saved by ambulance or police, but most of them are fire service rescues. What I did is I put both the fatalities and the injured in a single box, so to say, and got 589 cases. And then I wanted to see what affected, what was the distinguishing features for a specific mode of evacuation. And so we developed this kind of flow chart, and we compared, for example, people self-evacuating from all the others, because we sort of assumed that we had a certain time table here that self-evacuation would be the quickest. So if that was the mode of evacuation, that would happen first. Only if self-evacuation wouldn't happen, we would have evacuation by neighbors, could have evacuation by neighbors. And if that wasn't the case either, it could be home care and first responders, and finally, potentially a fatality. So we use this to compare. And we developed a lot of those charts, which are the same type that I showed before. I will not show you all of them because that would take too much time. But I want to show one, which is comparing generally survival with injuries compared to fatalities. The reason that I wanted to have survival with injuries and not all the non-fatal fires was that I actually wanted fires that was hazardous for the individual in the fire, because a lot of fires are also quite small. What we can see when we compare them are that fires with survivors are typically small when the fire service arrive, and this is indicative of a fuel limited fire. We also in the study included macro variables. There are variables that describe the municipality where the fire happens, and we can see that a high fraction in an urban area increases the probability of survival. And looking more closely at this, we can see that it's both related to proximity to neighbors and to the fire service. We can also see aspects that are linked to a decreased probability of survival, high age, physical and cognitive disabilities often involved. And we also have causes regarding candles and smoking, which typically ignite clothes or your bed or where you are. So it might be more difficult to evacuate. It might be of interest to see how the neighbors noticed the fire in the cases where they performed the rescue. This turned out to be quite difficult. So we got a very high number of unknowns, 64%. But we can see that we have a range of different way of noticing the fire, both smoke alarm, seeing flames and hearing sounds, or smell smoke. It would be interesting to develop this more so we can know more about the distribution among way of noticing the fire. Also, in the cases with home care personnel rescues, we investigate how did they become aware of the fire. And we can see that the most common way of doing it is through the safety alarm. Older people with limited abilities typically have this kind of button on their arm where they can push to get first to talk to the home care personnel and get help if they need it. And we see that this is very important to find these fires. We also notice that they see it during scheduled visits. Conclusions for this study, very briefly, is that of the older adults who were injured, less than half evacuated independently. And we know that neighbors and home care are very important, and also the fire service, as we know before. We also see that the safety alarm is a key for successful rescue for the older adults. And you can probably increase even further if you connect the smoke alarm to the safety alarm. This was a very brief presentation description. You can find more information in these papers. They are all open access, so you can simply Google the title if you want to read more. You can also look at my PhD thesis, where I have more discussion regarding those studies, but also include a lot of information regarding prevention. You're also very welcome to send me an email on the email below. Thank you for listening.